to another Apollo Papyrus episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For the 200th episode of this podcast, my interview guest is a travel writer, photographer, and the author of 4 books, the newest of which is titled On to Plan C, A Return to Travel, and is about travel in a post-COVID lockdown world. His name is Jeremiah Gilbert, and here's my interview with Jeremiah. Jeremiah Gilbert, welcome to Apollo Papyrus.
Thank you for having me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Yeah, so my name's Jeremiah Gilbert. I'm a travel writer and photographer based out of Southern California. So if you're familiar with the area, I'm halfway between Los Angeles and Palm Springs. So that means our winters are mild, but our summers are hot because I'm right on the verge of the desert. I've been a photographer since high school, back in the days when film was the only option. Started traveling in 2005. My first big trip was to Tibet, and that's when I switched to digital photography. And while I sort of wrote about my travels, I didn't really start to write about them till close around 2018, 2019. And then put together my first book in 2020 when the pandemic hit and travel wasn't an option. So I just started looking back on my travels, and the first book was a collection of travel tales from my first 15 years of travel.
How many countries have you been to in your lifetime?
Right now, I sit at 99. I will hit country 100 in May.
Your most recent book is called On to Plan C. Without spoiling too much of On to Plan C, what is that book about?
So that book I decided, so that was going to document my return to travel. So, 2020 here in California, March is when we sort of shut down. And pretty much April, I realized, okay, this is going to take a while. We're going to be, home for a while. My first trip canceled was going to be Fiji and New Zealand, and I had a credit with Air Fiji. So go ahead 2 years, credit's about to expire. So this is May 2022. Things are seeming a little better. So I told my wife, let's use the credit. Let's spend a week in Fiji and see how it goes. And so I thought it'd be interesting with this book, not to dwell on post-pandemic, but to get a sense of, the ever-changing landscape, testing requirements, vaccination proof, etc. So the title On to Plan C actually comes from the second chapter in the book, which was the summer trip. So originally we had planned to sail up West Africa. That was Plan A, but it got canceled. And then Plan B was we were going to go into Northern Europe, the highlight being a couple of nights in St. Petersburg. But then Russia decided to invade Ukraine. So that got canceled. And so I told my wife, okay, let's just do it on our own. Let's hit a few countries we've not been to. So that's Plan C. And to me, it kind of gave the sense of exactly what I wanted to write about, which is, things are opening up, but you still need to be flexible. You never quite know. And also, this is the first book to also include my photography. The previous travel books were just writing. This one, there's a chapter on Fiji and then photos from that trip. And then there's a chapter on Europe and photos from that trip, which was very enjoyable to do. And I plan on doing that for all future books.
You've written 3 other books, and all of them, like On to Plan C, are all travel related. Without spoiling too much of each of your other 3 books, what are each of them called and what are they about?
So, excuse me. The first one is Can't Get Here From There. That was the first book. So basically, I had started writing travel tales for my current website. And that was 2018, 2019. So 2020, again, when we realized we weren't going to travel, I got thinking, hey, why don't I see if I put these together? Each one's short, 2-3 pages. I put together 50 of them. I thought that sounded like a good number. And so like I said, it pretty much covered 2005 to 2020. The title actually comes from the last piece in that book, which was January 2020. My wife, who's Chinese, had gone back to Beijing for the Chinese New Year when all of this was happening. And we weren't sure we were going to get her home. There was a couple times there's more than one canceled flight and panicked crying calls from her and me calling airlines. So it was just sort of, it was a interesting time, but it allowed me an opportunity to, focus on the writing, which I really enjoyed. So I thought, okay, I'd like to do this again. Now what? Um, so I used to. So my very first website when I very first started traveling was more narrative. I would tell the story based on my journals, where I went, what I saw, and then there would be links. So click here, you see photos of the Potala Palace or Angkor Wat or what have you. So I thought, well, I've pretty much already written all of that. That covered like my first 5 years of travel. So the next book was the From Tibet to Egypt. And basically, it was exactly that. It was each trip, the journals. I reread them, re-edited them, but pretty much. So that was a quick one to put together, and then decided, then the On to Plan C came about. That one was different in that the previous books were all about past travels, whereas On to Plan C was current travels. So, for instance, I went to Fiji in May and then wrote that chapter and edited those photos in June, and then I was back on the road in July, August, September, editing, writing. So it was a very different experience. But I tend to get bored very easily. So having each of my books being sort of a different format and a different approach is not surprising to me. And hopefully readers enjoy the changes, or will at least find one that they really can engage with.
Why did you not include your photographs in any of your first three books?
Two reasons. One, so the first book I just wanted to focus on the writing. I just thought, this is something new. I'm just going to focus on that. And then honestly, I didn't know I could. I didn't realize that the publisher mostly published poetry and some essays, and so I didn't even think about it. So the next couple of books I just kept with the writing, and it happened to be Michael Palin had done a series. His most recent is Into Iraq, and I thought it might be his last adventure. He's in his 80s now, and so I ordered the companion book. And when it arrived, it had his essentially his journals and then photos throughout. And I thought, oh, I really like this format. I really like this idea. And also some reviews. Like my second book was getting very good reviews, but a couple of the reviewers like, he keeps talking about photography, but there's no photos here. So I reached out to the publisher and I said, could you include photos? And they said, yeah, sure, no problem. So I was like, oh, okay, I probably should have asked sooner. So it was sort of happenstance in that regard. But like I said, I'm very happy I asked. It added an extra level of editing because doing the writing and the photography and figuring out where to put the photos. But I really enjoyed the experience, and I hope it gives a more complete picture for the reader now.
Do you write your book manuscripts while traveling, or do you only do that while at home or in your home area of Southern California?
Normally, once I get home, though it depends. I mean, the last trip in the book, sort of during the travels, I got hit with how to introduce it. So I wrote like the first 5 pages, and then we end up having a delay at the end. We're supposed to fly home from Miami. The flight got canceled. We had to spend a night in Miami, which is not a bad thing. But that sort of allowed me to process and think. And then suddenly I had the ending. So normally it's afterwards. Same thing with the photos. I tend to edit photos once I get home. But in this case, I did do a little bit on the road.
Are all your books self-published, traditionally published, or hybrid published, or did you use different publishing methods for each of your books?
Yeah, these are all, I would say, hybrid published. It's a publish on demand, but there's no fee involved. That one was kind of odd. I actually started, in terms of writing, I started life as a poet, and I've published four poetry collections. And so my current publisher is the publisher of the most recent poetry collection. So that's why I was saying I wasn't sure about the photography because they tended to mostly publish uh, poetry or maybe some literary essays. So when I originally reached out to them, I said, "Hey, I have this idea of a collection of travel tales. Would you be interested?" And they said yes. And so I've just stuck with them. They have a very good department for now for the artistic endeavors. All the covers, the photographs are mine, and then they figure out the layout for the text. In fact, we did something odd for the new book, which is there's actually a lot going on the cover, and so we actually did not put the title on the cover. We just put my name on the cover, and you have to open the book to actually get the title of the book. Not sure if that was a good idea or not, but it made sense at the time. So let's try something new.
I would be more apt to do the opposite, put the title of the book on the cover, leave my name off of it, and then you'd have to go to like the title page in the front matter
Hey,
to
maybe
find
the
the
next book
author.
I'll do that.
You mentioned moments ago that, excuse me, you mentioned moments ago that you did a few poetry collections. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, it was one of those. I've always written. So I used to write short stories. I've drafted two novels, um, and then as I got a little older, let's say 20s, I had always written poetry. I started writing very formalist poetry, um, and then broke away from that, got more into free verse and blank verse. And there was a time in my life that I was just writing a lot of
I'm going
poems.
to decline a call here. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go back to the previous question I asked. You mentioned moments ago that you've written poetry collections. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I've always written. When I was younger, I wrote short stories. I've drafted two novels, and wrote poetry. And the early poetry was very formal. And then I discovered, free verse and blank verse, and really enjoyed that. And there was a time in my life I was just writing a lot of poems. And then one day I sort of realized, hey, most of these sort of fit a theme. So let me put them all together. Let me kind of organize them and see what I've got. And I realized I think I have a collection here, organized around a theme. So I put that together. So this was late 90s, early 2000s. And I had been publishing in smaller magazines and anthologies and such. And so I just sort of, okay, I'm not sure what to do with this, and started sending it out to publishers and found one in New York that agreed to publish the first collection, which was a traditional publishing house and traditional publishing agreement. And so that came out, I think, 2004. And okay, I'm a published poet now. This is kind of nice. And then, between the time that book was put together and I'd found a publisher, I had continued to write, and I had quite a lot of miscellaneous poems. They weren't necessarily on a theme. So I remember one day I printed them all out and I spread them across the living room and tried to figure out, okay, how in the world can I make sense of this? Do I have another collection here? Um, and then that one, it just all of a sudden dawned to me one day. So the second poetry collection is a little different because it's I call it a countdown. It starts with like 10 love poems and then nine, miscellaneous poems and etc. So once I figured out there was a pattern to that one, I put that together, and then just sort of every few years I'd keep writing. Once I had enough together, and I thought there was some sort of way of putting them together that made sense as a collection, I did. The fourth one, which was the first one with my current publisher, that one I had actually written many, many years ago. I had finished it, but by then I really wasn't writing much poetry anymore. So I just kind of set it aside, didn't really think about it. And then one day, this publisher reached out to me and said, "Hey, we're a poetry publisher. We're looking for manuscripts. Do you happen to have anything?" And so I dug out that unpublished fourth collection and I gave it a read and I went, "Hey, this isn't so bad." And I did some edits and I found a title for a long sequence that never really had a title and swapped out a poem and said, "Hey, here you go. What do you think?" So I've not written any since, but it did sort of open the door to work with the publisher I'm now working with. So I'm thankful for that.
Where are some places where your work as a photographer has been exhibited other than your book On to Plan C?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate. I've it's been exhibited. There's a gallery in Greece in Athens that's exhibited some of my work. Glasgow and Scotland. There's a Glasgow photography museum there that's done some of my pieces. I've had my work included in a workshop in India. I couldn't attend, but they sent me a link to show me how they discussed it. That was on street photography. That was interesting. The photos were actually from China, but the workshop happened in India. So there's been quite a few. In fact, some of my photos have been exhibited in areas that I've not been to, which I think is kind of cool. The photos made it before I've made it. I hope to make it there someday, like Glasgow. I've not been. I've been to Scotland, but not to Glasgow.
What is the make and model of the camera you use for travel photography work?
My current camera is the Nikon Z6. So that was my first. I've been shooting Nikon for many, many years. This is my first foray into mirrorless photography. I used to shoot the DF, which was their smallest DSLR. I love that camera, but it reached a point where I needed the processor was getting a little old. So when the Z6 came out, I thought everything on paper sounds good. I tend to rent cameras to try them out. I rented it. When I do try out a new camera, I have sort of a series of photos I take. That's sort of my way of testing the camera. And this camera, I took it straight out of the box on auto, just shot a couple of these. They turned out wonderful. And I normally don't shoot in auto. I just thought I would try. And it just has such a great feel. And I really like the processor. The color is incredible. So that's been my companion for the past few years.
My final question: what has been your most interesting travel experience so far?
I always go back to Tibet, which was my first major trip, simply because it was just such an incredible trip and just really opened my eyes and really made me want to travel. Though I would say, you know, most interesting in general was a few years ago. My wife and I, so we met while traveling. She's Chinese, was living in London. We met in Tunisia, so that itself is quite a story. But a few years after that, we decided to retrace part of the Silk Road in so mostly China, and then Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, which this involved because China is huge. We went from east to west, many sleeper trains, some very interesting experiences. When I got to Central Asia, it's the first time ever that people asked to have their photos taken with me because they do not see Westerners very often. And, I'm rather tall and pale. And they were like very surprised. As I was surprised. I've never had that experience before. And just seeing, I mean, we were in Kashgar, which is the westernmost city in China. We went to this livestock market, which after I researched it, turns out it's been happening like every Sunday predating Marco Polo. I mean, it's just incredible. Uh, so that whole trip, I mean, it was rough. It was, very challenging. Keeping the camera clean was not easy. Uh, using my camera bag as a pillow on some of these sleeper trains because I wanted to keep, that was the most important thing to me. So that, that stayed on me at all times. But that was, end of the day, that was an incredible trip. We look back on it now and we're like, don't know how we did it. Tibet was sort of the same, being my first trip that was rougher than it probably should have been, but I didn't know any better. And so, yeah, I look back on it fondly. I think now, yeah, I don't know that my back could handle it, but uh, that was a great trip. But no, that Silk Road trip, and someday I'd like to go back. And yeah, we've been to two of the five stands now. I'd really like to get back and explore the others.
Jeremiah, thank you for appearing on Apollo Papyrus. You are a wonderful guest.
Oh, thank you for having me. Been very enjoyable.
Jeremiah was a fascinating guest to interview for my 200th episode. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write and read your passion. Bye for now. Remember to subscribe to the Apollo Papyrus YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/@Apollo Papyrus and the Apollo Papyrus Substack newsletter at apollopapyrus.substack.com. Y'all can visit the Apollo Papyrus website at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/Apollo Papyrus and follow Apollo Papyrus on Threads, Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr at Apollo Papyrus. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.